If you walk along Riverside Drive on Manhattan today, stopping between 73rd and 74th Streets, you will see a massive but utterly faceless brick residential complex. It is called Schwab House. Thousands of people pass by this sign every day without even suspecting that their souls are treading on ground that hides one of the most grandiose and tragic secrets in New York history. Exactly 100 years ago, on this very spot, there stood something that defied the imagination of an ordinary person. It was not just a house, it was a palace that would make French kings blush. 75 rooms, $6 million in gold. Its own power plant capable of lighting a small town. It was a residence meant to stand for 1,000 years, but it didn't last even half a century. The story I will tell you is not just a chronicle of brick and marble. It is the anatomy of human hubris. It is the tale of a man who built the steel skeleton of modern America, but could not build comfort for his own soul. His name was Charles Michael Schwab. And no, he has no relation to the modern brokerage firm. Our hero was a man of a completely different caliber. He was the first president of the United States Steel Corporation. He was Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man. He was the one who could lose in a single evening at the Monte Carlo casino as much as an ordinary worker earned in 5 lifetimes and still smile as if he had won the whole world. But how did it happen that a man who possessed a fortune equivalent to today's billions died bankrupt, leaving behind only debts and the empty corridors of the largest private house in New York? Why did his widow, the owner of the castle called Riverside, fear leaving her bedroom? To understand the end, we need to go back to the beginning. Not to the palace, but to the dust of Pennsylvania's roads. Imagine the year 1879. The small town of Loretto. A 17-year-old boy works behind the counter in a grocery store for $3 a week. He was not an engineering genius. He was not a hereditary aristocrat. He had only one talent that was worth more than any oil rig. Charles Schwab knew how to charm. He had a phenomenal memory for names and faces. He could make a stern foreman feel like a king and a tired worker believe in a great mission. It was this gift, this almost supernatural ability to be liked by people, that became his first capital. His rise was vertical. In a world ruled by stern, bearded titans like Morgan and Rockefeller, Schwab was an anomaly. He was the happy capitalist. He wore expensive suits, his pockets were full of diamond stick pins that he could give to a casual acquaintance. He loved opera, loved risk, and pathologically could not save money. If Andrew Carnegie was a thrifty Scotsman who counted every cent, then Charles Schwab was the embodiment of the American dream of endless abundance. It seemed impossible that such a bright fire could go out. By 1901, Charles Schwab had reached the pinnacle of the world. He was only 39 years old when he became president of the world's first corporation with $1 billion capitalization. His salary was astronomical, $100,000 a year officially, but with bonuses it exceeded $1 million. He held in his hands the levers of control over an industry that was changing the face of the planet. Schwab's steel went into skyscrapers, bridges, and railroads. He was the king of New York. And like any king, he needed a castle. But here begins the first paradox of our story. At that time, all of New York's elite, the Astors, Vanderbilts, Fricks, lived on Fifth Avenue. It was the gold standard. It was the center of the universe. Living anywhere else meant being an outcast. But Charles Schwab, this eternal gambler, decided that the rules were not written for him. He looked at the map of Manhattan and made a bet that surprised everyone. He did not want to crowd onto Fifth Avenue. He wanted space, air, and a view of the river. He chose Riverside Drive. At that time, it was the outskirts, almost a village compared to the center. Rich people did not live there, but Schwab was confident. Where he went, fashion would follow. He decided to build a house that would eclipse everything New York had ever seen. He conceived not just a mansion, but a copy of the French castle of Chenonceau, transported to the banks of the Hudson. He bought an entire city block. This was the beginning of his most ambitious project, and, as time would show, his most beautiful mistake. No one knew then that, laying the first stone in the foundation of Riverside, Charles Schwab began building his own golden cage. To understand why this mansion became an obsession, we need to look into the soul of its creator. Charles Schwab was not just a rich man. He was a psychological phenomenon, a man who categorically refused to believe in the limits of the possible. His roots go back to the clay soil of Pennsylvania, to a world where the only prospect was hard work until the grave. But Schwab possessed a rare gift. He saw gold where others saw only dirt. His philosophy was simple and dangerous. Risk everything to get everything. This worldview was formed not in libraries, but in the workshops of the Edgar Thomson plant. Young Charlie, working for Andrew Carnegie himself, understood the main truth of the industrial age. Technical knowledge is important, but the ability to manage people is priceless. He knew the names of thousands of workers. He could play the piano in a dirty barrack so that stern steelworkers cried. This was not just charisma, it was a strategy. He sold not steel, he sold enthusiasm. The key moment that determined the fate of Schwab and his future palace occurred on December 12, 1900. It was the famous dinner at the University Club of New York. It was there that the 38-year-old Schwab stood before J.P. Morgan himself, the financial god of America, and delivered a speech that changed the world economy. Without a single piece of paper, relying only on his hypnotic voice, he painted a picture of a supercorporation that would unite the entire steel industry. Morgan listened, chewed his cigar, and remained silent. By the end of the evening, the deal was done. Thus was born United States Steel, the first company in history worth $1 billion. This triumph brought Schwab a fortune that burned his hands. Unlike his mentor Carnegie, who preached modesty and believed that dying rich was a disgrace, Schwab wanted to live here and now. He craved recognition. But New York at the beginning of the 20th century was a cruel place for upstarts. Old money, the Astor and Vanderbilt clans, looked at Schwab as a talented but vulgar provincial. To them, he was the king of soot, a man who made money too quickly and too loudly. It was this social conflict that became the foundation of Riverside. Schwab did not want to knock on the closed doors of Fifth Avenue, begging to be accepted into the circle of the elite. His ambition was grander. He decided to create his own center of attraction. His logic was paradoxical. If society does not accept him on its terms, he will build a house that will force society to change the geography of success. He bought the plot on Riverside Drive not because it was fashionable, but because there was enough space there to unfold the full breadth of his ego. This was the decision of a gambler who bets all his chips on zero. He challenged the unwritten laws of New York, deciding that his personal greatness would be enough to turn the outskirts into a new elite center. He hired the French architect Maurice Hébert, a man who built not houses, but sets for monarchs. Schwab said to him just one phrase that defined everything: "Make it look like a castle that has stood here for 300 years. He wanted to buy himself a history that he didn't have. But in this story, there is a quiet, almost invisible character without whom the portrait of the Steel King would be incomplete. This is Urana Rana Schwab. If Charles was a firework, then Rana was water. She was not a typical millionaire's wife with a wasp waist and a love for social soirees. She was a plump, shy woman from the same Pennsylvania backwoods who preferred a quiet game of bridge to noisy balls. And here lies the main irony. The most pompous house in New York was being built for a woman whose true dream was simple coziness. Their union became a strange merging of two life speeds. Charles dragged her to the top of Olympus, while Rana desperately clung to the ground. Schwab sincerely believed that this palace would become her throne, a place where she would finally be accepted as the Queen of New York. But he did not understand that for Rana, the gigantic scale of Riverside was not a reward, but a source of anxiety. She looked at Morris Heber's blueprints and saw in them not grandeur, but cold loneliness in a golden frame. In 1901, construction began that shocked the city. It was a true marriage of progress and tradition, reflecting the essence of Schwab himself. He used what made him rich: steel. The mansion's framework was assembled from the same powerful I-beams as the first skyscrapers. It was the strongest skeleton made of Pennsylvania metal, capable of withstanding an earthquake. But on the outside, this industrial monster was clad in elegant French limestone and pink granite. This was a brilliant architectural disguise, raw, modern American power hidden under the mask of refined European aristocracy of the 16th century. Hundreds of stonemasons, woodcarvers, and artists were turning the corner of Riverside Drive into a set for a non-existent fairy tale. Schwab wanted to create the illusion of eternity with new money. He imported antiques not by the crate, but by entire shipholds. But as the walls rose higher, the social chasm only widened. The Fifth Avenue elite watched with cold smirks through binoculars as the upstart built his personal Versailles on the wrong side of the park. Schwab thought he was building a bridge to high society, but in reality, he was erecting a fortress wall that would soon cut him and Rana off from reality. Let's mentally transport ourselves to 1906 and pass through the massive bronze gates that separated Charles Schwab's estate from the rest of the world. The first thing that struck a visitor was not luxury, but the deafening silence of scale. Crossing the threshold of Riverside, a person found themselves in a space where footsteps sank into the depths of carpets and voices were lost under vaulted ceilings painted with gold. This was not a home. It was an architectural declaration of independence. 50,000 square feet, 75 rooms. These figures are hard to grasp abstractly, but imagine it this way. Schwab's mansion was so vast that several ordinary Fifth Avenue townhouses could fit inside it, with room left over for a ballroom. The interiors were created not for comfort, but for intimidation. The grand hall with its ceremonial staircase of white marble was designed so that anyone entering would feel small. It was a stage on which Charles Schwab planned to play the role of an American monarch. Every room was a journey through centuries and continents, collected in one place thanks to the steel magnate's checkbook. Here were Flemish tapestries that remembered the cold of medieval castles and carved wooden panels brought from ancient French estates. Schwab did not just buy furniture. He bought the atmosphere of a lineage that he didn't have. The library was filled with rare volumes, which, by irony of fate, the owner rarely touched, preferring live conversation to book dust. The dining room could seat 100 guests, but often only 2 dined there. Charles and Rana, sitting at opposite ends of an endless table, as if separated by an ocean of mahogany. But the true psychological portrait of Schwab was hidden not in the golden stucco, but in those rooms that were concealed from outsiders' eyes. Riverside was perhaps the most technologically advanced house of its era. In the deep basements, where guests never descended, the industrial heart of the palace beat. Its own power plant capable of lighting a small town, an air purification system, 3 elevators. All this spoke to the fact that Schwab, a romantic on the outside, remained a steel pragmatist on the inside. He wanted to live in a French chateau, but with 20th century American comfort. There was a full-sized pool lined with mosaic, and even its own bowling alley, an unheard-of luxury for a private home. But the most intimate, the most telling element of this colossus was the organ. It was located in the main gallery and cost $50,000. It was not just an instrument, but a therapeutic capsule for the magnate's soul. Charles Schwab often suffered from insomnia and nervous strain. At night, when the city fell silent, he would summon his personal organist, Archer Gibson. Imagine this scene, a huge dark hall where the only source of light is the stained glass windows illuminated by street lamps. The small figure of one of the richest men on the planet sits in an armchair, eyes closed, while the powerful sounds of Bach or Wagner fill the emptiness of the 75 rooms. In these moments, Riverside ceased to be a tool of social dominance and became a sanctuary. Music was the only language on which this gigantic house could speak sincerely. However, behind all this splendor lurked a cold emptiness. The servants in the house moved silently, like shadows. There were dozens of them, footmen, maids, cooks, engineers maintaining the basement mechanisms. But because of the enormous size of the building, it often seemed deserted. The architecture of Riverside worked against its owners. It was created for crowds, for balls, for receptions of kings, but most of the time it served as an echo for the loneliness of two people. Every statue, every Titian or Rembrandt painting on the wall screamed of status, but whispered that happiness here was merely a guest who never unpacked his suitcases. Schwab built a dream house, but forgot to consider that in a castle of such size, it is very easy to lose each other. While the outside world admired the stone lace of the facade, inside Riverside, a quiet but destructive human drama was unfolding. Here we come to the most painful paradox of Charles Schwab's life. He built this house as the greatest monument to his success, but fate turned it into a backdrop for his deepest failure. In these 75 rooms, amid silks and marble, the most important element was missing, without which any home is dead. There were no children's voices. The marriage of Charles and Rana was childless. And if, in a modest home, this could have been just a shared sorrow in the scale of a palace designed for a dynasty, it became a deafening tragedy. Imagine this acoustics of emptiness. Every morning, walking through the endless corridors, Rana Schwab saw dozens of empty bedrooms that would never become children's rooms. This house, meant to be a cradle for the heirs of the Steel Empire, became a luxurious mausoleum for unfulfilled hopes. It is here that Rana's figure acquires tragic scale. She could not cope with the role of Queen of New York imposed on her by her husband. With each year, she withdrew deeper into herself. Suffering from excess weight and complexes, she became a prisoner of her own palace. While Charles shone at social soirees, charming journalists and politicians with his famous smile, Rana locked herself in her chambers. Riverside did not protect her from the world, it cut her off from it. She spent her days playing bridge with a narrow circle of friends, afraid to cross the threshold of the very dream her husband had built for her. And here arises the moral ambivalence of our hero. Who was Charles Schwab at this moment? A loving husband who gives his wife the whole world, or an egoist who uses his wife as justification for his vanity? The answer is more complex than it seems. Schwab, this eternal optimist and happy capitalist, did not know how to cope with grief. He did not share the silence with his wife. Instead, he chose escape. His escape became extravagance and a secret life. While Rana withered in the golden cage on Riverside Drive, Charles sought confirmation of his manhood in other places. Historians would later reveal a detail that casts a shadow on his impeccable public image. Schwab had a mistress, Marianne Davis, and from her he had a daughter. Think about this monstrous irony. The man whose legitimate palace of 75 rooms stood childless maintained a secret family in the shadows. He could buy everything, antiques, respect, steel mills, but he could not buy happiness in his own home. World War I brought fabulous profits to the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, which Schwab headed at the time. He became one of the richest people on the planet. Money flowed like a river, and Schwab spent it with frenzied speed, as if trying to bury his inner emptiness with gold. He organized receptions in Riverside, about which legends were made, but at these parties of life, Rana was often absent. Guests drank champagne, admired the organ and tapestries, but the host, smiling at everyone, knew deep down this house was a lie. It was a stage without the leading actress, a temple without a deity. By the end of the 1920s, the moral conflict reached its peak. Schwab was America's favorite, a philanthropist and an industrial genius. But behind the closed doors of Riverside, he was a lonely old man, wandering through halls stuffed with treasures and hearing only the echo of his own footsteps. He created a monument to himself, but this monument began to devour its creator. The grandeur of the mansion no longer inspired, it oppressed, and the air already smelled of the storm that was gathering to wash away both this success and this illusion of stability. The year 1929 was approaching. October 1929 divided history into before and after. The stock market crash struck Charles Schwab with the cruelty of a blacksmith's hammer. In one day, his paper empire, built on faith in endless growth, crumbled to dust. But the worst was happening not on Wall Street, but within the walls of Riverside. This house, created as a hymn to wealth, instantly turned into an insatiable monster devouring its creator. Schwab, true to his nature as an incorrigible optimist, at first refused to believe in the catastrophe. He continued to live as if nothing had happened, spending his last money on maintaining an army of servants and heating 75 rooms. But reality was inexorable. Property taxes rose and income vanished. The palace that was supposed to inspire envy now inspired pity. It became a white elephant, too expensive to maintain and too huge to sell. It was at this moment that the complete transformation of the mansion's meaning occurred. Schwab, realizing he had lost, tried to make one last beautiful gesture. He offered to donate Riverside to the city of New York to make it the official residence of the mayor. This was an attempt to turn personal ego into public property, to save the house from oblivion. The response of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia became the final verdict on the Gilded Age. "Me? In that?" exclaimed the mayor. He refused. Even as a gift, this palace was not needed by the city. It was too grandiose, too impractical, too detached from the reality of democratic America in the 1930s. Schwab understood. He had built not a legacy, but an anachronism. The finale was quiet and mournful. In January 1939, Rana died. Charles, having lost his anchor, faded away just a few months later. The man who had handled hundreds of millions died bankrupt. His debts exceeded $300,000. Riverside remained standing as a dark, cold tombstone over a dream that proved too expensive even for the Steel King. Inside reigned silence, broken only by the footsteps of creditors come to inventory the property. After the death of Charles and Rana Schwab, their great project Riverside turned into New York's largest ghost. For almost 10 years, the palace stood empty, gazing at the Hudson with the dark sockets of its windows. Imagine this picture. During World War II, when the world was burning in flames, this monument to past luxury was slowly dying from neglect. Children from the surrounding streets sneaked into the garden that had once been guarded like a state border and played hide-and-seek among moss-covered statues. The finale came in 1947. First, a humiliating public auction. It resembled looting on a battlefield. The magnificent organ, the soul of the house, was sold for just a couple $1,000s. Stained glass windows, tapestries, carved furniture, everything that Schwab had collected piece by piece to buy himself a history, was scattered into hands for next to nothing. The interiors were gutted, leaving only the naked skeleton of ambitions. And in 1948, heavy machinery arrived at the gates. But here occurred the last, almost mystical act of resistance. The house refused to die. The walls were so massive, and the steel frame, made from the best steel of Schwab's own factories, so sturdy, that ordinary wrecking balls bounced off it like rubber balls. The workers had to spend 6 weeks burning the wooden floors inside to weaken the structure even somewhat. Schwab had built a house for the ages, and even after his death, his creation fought for life with the stubbornness of its creator. Today, in the place of Riverside, between 73rd and 74th Streets, stands a massive but utterly utilitarian brick residential complex, Schwab House. The irony of history is absolute. Where one man tried to occupy space enough for 100, now 650 families truly live in standard apartments. The era of individual grandeur has been replaced by the era of collective efficiency. Charles Schwab was the real Great Gatsby, long before Fitzgerald wrote his novel. Like Gatsby, he believed that the past could be rewritten with a checkbook. He believed that if he built a beautiful enough castle, happiness would surely settle in it. But his legacy teaches us a harsh truth. Architecture can outlive centuries, but only if it is filled with life, not just ambitions. Charles Schwab's steel still holds the skeletons of Manhattan skyscrapers and San Francisco bridges. His industrial genius truly changed the world. But his personal dream, the Riverside House, turned to dust. This is a reminder to us all. We can build palaces to be remembered, but we truly live only in what we give to the world, not in what we hide behind high fences. Schwab's story is not a tale about money. This is a story about the fact that the most expensive home is the one where someone is waiting for you. And this cannot be bought even for $6 million in gold.